Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel. In this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. First, let's start with South Donetsk direction with Novomikhailivka. As you can see, we have a lot of very interesting geolocations, and most of them are how the Russians managed to establish complete control of the village, how the Russians, let's say, raised the flags in the western part of the town. So the Russians just continue, let's say, celebrating the glorious victory. That was a very difficult battle. As we know, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Main Ukrainian forces left Novomikhailivka a few days ago, and currently the Ukrainians are trying to set another defense belt around Paraskovyevka. But the problems are very huge from the Ukrainian side, and because today we continue receiving the complaints from the 79th Air Mobile Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine, they were saying that they were describing the battle, the last days of the clashes for Novomikhailivka. They're saying that everything was okay until the, let's say, 15th of April. So by that day, the Ukrainians still had possibilities to hold the defense line in the western part. They still had possibilities to destroy Russian armored vehicles, personal carriers. They still had some support and supply with FPV drones, but after 16th of April, for some reason, the commander of this brigade, of this probably direction, decided to start supporting the Ukrainians in the western part of Novomikhailivka. So after the 16th of April, the Ukrainians for the next few days were staying on their positions without any support. So on the 16th, 17th, 18th, and let's say 20th of April, the Ukrainians still were in Novomikhailivka, but without water, without food, without cigarettes, without weapon, without anything. And let's say right before the Russians established complete control over Novomikhailivka, the Ukrainian sergeants on the ground decided to fall back and to abandon their positions. Later, according to the complaints of the 79th Brigade, those sergeants were captured by the Ukrainians and were blamed as the traitors who left their positions. So the situation is critical. Anyway, regarding the situation with 79th Brigade, with Novomikhailivka, we start receiving first updates of how the Russians move their focus further to Paraskovyevka. Now we have a lot of geolocations, a lot of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. So basically we can say that on the, let's say, 22nd, 21st, 24th of April, the Russians began the next wave, the next stage of offensive operation, and now they're going to attack in Paraskovyevka. Now we are moving a little bit to the south in direction of Ugledar. We continue receiving the updates from the Russian side of how they were bombing and destroying and FPV droning the Ukrainian positions to the south of the stronghold. We continue receiving significant number of geolocations. We've received significant number of geolocations recently, and we continue receiving them. So most likely very soon, probably in a day or two, the Russians will start the ground operation. If we increase the numbers of updates, then it will, let's say, explain us everything. We see significant number of geolocations. We see a very rich network of Ukrainian, let's say, fortifications, and it's a very difficult thing to clear them all, but the Russians are, let's say, are moving on this direction. Now we're moving to the most important area, to Avdiivka direction, to Acheretina. We have adjusted the map. As you can see, the Russians established the control over more than 50% of the settlement, according to Russian sources and according to reports we received from the Russian sources this morning. Yesterday in the evening, the talks were about just 30-40% of the stronghold. Now the sources are saying about more than 50. When talking about the deep state pro-Ukrainian mappers, as you can see, they show that the Russians control just 30% of the settlement. But if you take a look at this, let's say, picture in details, you're gonna see that the rest of Novomikhailivka up to 70%. So the rest of Novomikhailivka is in the gray zone. So which confirms that most likely the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from the area. And today we start receiving additional updates about the situation and the question, and we received an answer to the question why the Ukrainians abandoned their positions in Novomikhailivka so fast. So the thing is that, as we discussed a few weeks ago, the situation with the 67th Brigade today, and we discussed that the situation when the Ukrainian soldiers of 67th Brigade abandoned their positions in Chasiv Yar would cause significant damage to entire Ukrainian spirit and willing to fight. We discussed that most likely now the Ukrainians would ask themselves a question: if the forces of 67th Brigade can, let's say, abandon their positions, so why we, the Ukrainians, other Ukrainian soldiers, why we are worse than them? for what reason. So that's why they also have a possibility and have, let's say, understanding that they can also abandon their positions without any consequences. And when the situation started developing not very good in Ocheretino, as we discussed, the forces of 115th Brigade basically left their positions, almost the entire brigade, without any resistance, and that allowed the Russians at the beginning of the first, let's say, days of operation to answer Ocheretino itself and to capture a few buildings and, let's say, to establish a very powerful, strong foothold for further offensive. And later the Ukrainians tried to stabilize the area. They tried to do something, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians have redeployed the forces of 47th Brigade with the purpose to stabilize the situation in the area. But later we got additional report from the 47, from, let's say, Ukrainian sources, from the sources on the ground, that when the Ukrainians redeployed the forces of 47th Mechanized Brigade to Ocheretino, the commanders of 47th Brigade reported that we've been on the line of combat contact for around a year. So it's time to start rotation. We will not fight because we are around a year on the line of combat contact. We demand to be replaced by anyone, by anybody. And of course, the Ukrainian commanders decided not to make the situation even worse, and they decided to send the 47th Brigade for rotation, completely remove this brigade from the line of combat contact. They just didn't want the development of the situation in, let's say, much worse, let's say, case. And the Ukrainians reported, the Russians reported that they brought some forces, some brigades to replace already 47th Brigade. And of course, it was like a certain day when everything should happen with the replacements of one brigade by another. And when the time came, the forces that were sent here for replacements, to replace 47th Brigade, they denied to answer Ocheretino. With the purpose to stabilize the situation. But the thing is that 47th Brigade also denied to stay here to wait, let's say, another brigade for replacement. So that situation led to the next thing. The 47th Brigade, because there was like a schedule, the date when they should be replaced, they left positions on Ocheretino according to the schedule, according to agreements between the commanders of 47th Brigade and, let's say, Ukrainian commanders. But the forces that should replace them didn't answer Ocheretino because they also refused, let's say, to answer due to the situation that there is a real hell on the ground. And that's all those things led to complete collapse of defense in this, one of the most important strongholds on the direction. Furthermore, we have another additional update from the Russian sources that today the Russians conducted a series of offensive operations to the south from Ocheretino. The Russians are pushing and moving to Novobakhmutovka from the north, and the Russians are pushing and attacking Novobakhmutovka from the southeast. And according to information we have, most likely the Russians managed to enter Novobakhmutovka, and most likely today, or maybe in the next few, today probably the Russians will establish complete control over the village, but Ministry of Defense will confirm this information just within the next few days. And of course, this will lead also to collapse and complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in the village by the name of Berdichi. So the situation continued developing, obviously not in Ukraine's favor, and currently nobody can tell for sure how exactly all the things is going to happen. Meanwhile, the Russian forces on the eastern flank continue bombing Novokalinovo Keramic, preparing the foothold for further offensive on the ground operation. So most likely they will start, let's say, support offensive on this direction just to break completely the Ukrainian spirit, the Ukraine willing to fight, and to force them to fall back much further to the west or to the north. Now we are moving to Chasiv Yar direction. The Russians still haven't launched any ground operation. The situation is critical, but the Ukrainians still are located in the eastern part. They're moving between the buildings. The Russians are bombing this area. The drones are flying, but without any changes on the ground. The most interesting updates are coming from the south, from the area between Ivanovsk and Chasiv Yar. Somehow the Ukrainians conducted a counteroffensive, and they published a 6-minute video of their counterattack on Russian positions. And according to that video, we can make a conclusion that for some reason the Ukrainians decided to attack on this direction, and as a result of Ukrainian attack, they established control over at least this part of the tree line between Klishchevka and Ivanovska. Currently, we can't tell for sure the purpose and the reason, let's say, the Ukrainian plans, what they were planning to, let's say, to achieve by this attack, but obviously they do have some plans. Maybe the Ukrainians are planning to start a series of counterattacks towards Ivanovska from Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and maybe one of the Ukrainian plans is to continue moving further to N32 road and to cut the Russians inside of Ivanovska. Currently, we can't tell for sure, but that attack was unexpected, something unexpected, and so I don't know what the Ukrainians were planning. It was just a media attack, or they have a further going plans. Razdolovka, as we discussed in the previous updates, according to some Russians, the Russian forces managed to enter and to establish control over the first buildings in the village. Today, the Ukrainian sources have already published the video of FPV drone bombing on the Russian soldiers in the vicinity of the village. Most likely, we will, let's say, geolocate these videos very soon, and then we will understand where exactly the Russians entered and what territories under complete Russian control. But regarding the FPV droning from the Ukrainian side and Russian progress on the ground, we continue receiving the videos of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions in Razdolovka itself. So the battle, the active phase of clashes for the village continues. Now we are moving to Kupiansk area, to Kharkiv area. We have additional updates, and the most interesting are coming, of course, from the borderlands. And according to information we have, the Ukrainian local administration, local authorities, let's say, started to ban the sale of alcohol, and which confirms that they want soldiers to be with a clear mind, because they expect the Russian will come this way soon. So that's why they don't need a lot of drunk soldiers on the line of combat contact, so they want to keep them as clear as possible. And this is also like one of the piece of evidence that the Russians may start offensive on this direction. Also today we got the statement of the governor of Belgorod region. He stated that as a result of Ukrainian aggression on the territory of this region, the Russians lost around 120 civilians, including 11 children. So 651 people were injured. So it was something like, not like explanation, probably was a media message to the Russian society that it's like this is the reason why we need to start the, let's say, buffer zone operation. Other sources, mainly Ukrainian sources, try to, let's say, to calm down the locals, trying to tell them that for now there is no, let's say, way how the Russians can start an offensive, because there is no any concentration of forces. So let's wait. Don't make any conclusions. Yesterday's destroyed TV tower doesn't mean anything, and many other things, trying probably to calm down the Ukrainians. Very interesting video is coming from Kherson directions. The Ukrainians continue playing with the flags. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians established another flag on the some tower on the Kazachia Lahiri, and then they start filming this area. Obviously they will wait some Russians who would be sent to this tower to take the flags off, and probably they will try to attack them with drones. Now we're moving to Europe. We have lots of very interesting updates, and the most important is that Poland, on the border between Ukraine and Poland, the NATO countries have already concentrated and collected significant number of armored vehicles, Bradleys, tanks, fighting vehicles, different types of weapon, and they're waiting just one thing: the signature of President Biden on the bill on another military package to Ukraine. This is going to happen. Today is Tuesday. This is going to happen. According to information we have, the Senate should vote for this law today, and most likely, if they vote today, tomorrow, day after, Biden will sign this agreement, this law, and then all these armored vehicles will be sent, will cross the border, and will become a legal target for the Russian missiles. And obviously, something big is going to happen during the next few days on the western border in the vicinity of Lvov. Obviously, the Russians will try to destroy these armored vehicles just in the western part and not allow the Ukrainians to redeploy these forces to the east. And another important thing from Ukraine: starting tomorrow, all consulates of Ukraine will stop providing services to men of draft age. So if you know that this law still hasn't been adopted, still hasn't, let's say, gets its legal power, but the Ukrainians already started, let's say, all these procedures, and they want people to come back back on Ukraine. And of course, if they come back to Ukraine for the documents, they would be sent to the line of combat contact immediately. So the situation is getting worse and worse, and probably most likely the 23rd of April will bring us additional updates, very interesting updates. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.